Mena-Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank.
For today's Mena-Talk, we've invited the journalist and author Hasnain Kazim, who recently published the book Islam and I, which we want to talk about today. Mr. Kazim, thank you very much for coming. In your book, you state that you are not a critic of Islam, and in fact, you don't actually know what an Islam critic is even supposed to be. Rather, you criticize what you find needs to be criticized. And what exactly do you mean by that? And what would be the critical aspects that you're referring to?
Well, the term critic of Islam, I'm bothered by it because it sounds as if one is criticizing Islam itself. I don't use terms like that. I also find critic of Israel difficult. Well, there are people who reject the state of Israel as such, but I'm also not a Germany critic or an Austria critic. Instead, I always criticize what I find worthy of criticism. And when it comes to Islam, it's those specific points that appear to me as deserving of critique. That's everything that is extremist in any way, but also that which restricts freedoms. And sadly, regarding Islam, I must admit there's a great deal I find myself needing to criticize. I find many things positive. My roots are Islamic. I was raised Christian. I'm non-denominational. But what I criticize about Islam, not Islam itself, but the way many Muslims, unfortunately, practice Islam is, for one thing, and we don't need to talk about this for long, everything that has to do with terror, Thus, where religion is violently exploited to assert political power, aiming to bring about significant changes. I've spent many years in Pakistan as a correspondent, been to Afghanistan quite a bit, know Iraq a little, and I've lived in Turkey. And all these attacks that happen, suicide attacks, bomb attacks and so on, that is, of course, something I strongly criticize in the name of religion, yes. And then I hear from other Muslims who also condemn it, but then say that it has nothing to do with Islam. That truly vexes me, because naturally it is deeply intertwined with Islam. People say we are doing this in the name of our religion. They shout, Allahu Akbar, God is great. So you can't dismiss that as something that has nothing to do with Islam. However, it is not the Islam. And I would genuinely hope that a great many Muslims who view this critically would also take it upon themselves to address and critique it personally. That's one area, terror and violence. But what also bothers me greatly, especially in countries like Germany, my homeland, and Austria, my current home, is the encroachment on our freedoms. We, partly due to terror, are compelled to do certain things out of fear. Christmas markets are being secured with various security measures put in place. Jewish men and women no longer dare to be recognizably visible on the streets. That bothers me. But I'm also deeply concerned by what I see happening in schools. I frequently read at schools, and then teachers tell me that Muslim boys say, I won't take orders from a woman. Yes, a teacher just recently told me they were on a class trip. They were told to be back at the youth hostel by 8 p.m. The 6 boys who were there said, we won't take any orders from you, you're a woman. Then that was criticized. The fathers reacted the same way, things like that. Or families saying, our daughter is not allowed to take part in swimming lessons or sports class. Or when someone says, why aren't you fasting, but not out of interest, but as a form of pressure, you have to fast. So it's something that is expected and demanded, so to speak. Or when someone says you're dressing in an un-Islamic way or far too revealingly, where I think it's not the business of the boys in a classroom to dictate to their female classmates how they should dress. Rather, it's a matter for the school to address. Perhaps some schools have uniforms, and for others it's clear that there are specific rules for how we dress while on school grounds. But it's not the business of Muslim boys, to exert pressure there.
You also describe some stories like that in your book. First, I'd like to bring up a story that you yourself recount in your book from Pakistan about how you met a cleric in a mosque there who hails from the city of Multan, which was evidently a hub for Sufism, and who, after a prolonged conversation, then confided in you with a complaint that dance and music are so severely suppressed there almost entirely by radical Muslims. Now the question is, why is that when even clerics say things like that? Is it the sheer violence of radical Islamists carrying this out? Or is it the fear among the more liberal-minded who then don't dare to speak up and say anything against it? Is it something like a silent agreement, perhaps? What do you think could be behind such a situation?
Well, it's a mix of many things. I was traveling around Multan there. It is located in central Pakistan and continues to be a vibrant center for Sufism. So that is a movement within Islam, a rather liberal, tolerant, and very much art-oriented form of Islam, featuring dance with the so-called whirling dervishes. That is Sufistic, and it also includes Qawwali chants. So it's actually something I personally find very beautiful. And I also say this because people sometimes ask, what is the good thing about Islam? Well, Islam, for instance, also yields magnificent art. Yes, when one observes ancient architecture, paintings, especially from South Asia, the miniatures, the drawings, the artworks, the music, the dances, it's profoundly beautiful. However, it currently faces immense pressure. And so I was traveling in Multan, conducting research on a completely different topic when I spotted this small mosque. I had some free time, so I decided to go inside and simply take a look around. I then met the cleric who was seated there, and he graciously invited me for a cup of tea. We started conversing, and he inquired if I was a person of faith and what my thoughts on Islam were. And there I was, fully aware that this place is truly the very heart of Sufism. And simultaneously, I know, for instance, from areas of Pakistan controlled by the Taliban, or, as is plainly evident globally in Afghanistan, where music is suppressed and outlawed, deemed haram and impermissible, where art itself is prohibited. Pictures cannot be displayed publicly, films are forbidden, and individuals are not permitted to appear in them. All of this is truly something incredibly hostile to art. So I thought I'd bring this up with him right now to see how he, as a cleric working in a mosque in a city that truly ought to be exceptionally art-friendly, genuinely perceives it. And I thought I can really tell him all of my criticisms. I mean, I'm never going to see him again anyway, so I'll just be brave and say it all. And he listened to me, and I expected him to throw me out at any moment. But he did not. Instead, he listened very carefully and attentively, then grew very thoughtful, and then said, "Yes, I can totally understand what you're saying, I do." And they also experience this immense pressure, even he as a cleric, that it stems from a radical faction, and that many things are simply no longer permitted. What's the reason for that, you ask? It certainly stems from people's fear of rebelling, of daring to say that it's not right, because those who forbid it, the Taliban, for example, are incredibly radical and outspoken. It's often a very loud minority. That determines the course of history. On the other hand, you also have to admit that it's unfortunately not just a small minority. There's quite a lot of approval, and when you converse with individuals whom you perceive as liberal, tolerant Muslims, you sometimes discover they may not be quite as liberal and tolerant as you thought. Instead, they actually find it quite proper, and they truly believe, yes, that's precisely how it ought to be. It's a contention over how to. To truly honor God in the right and proper manner, yes. And you can do that, like I know it from Christianity because I was socialized in it myself. You can achieve that by making it very art-friendly. Johann Sebastian Bach's music, for instance, is a celebration of God in a way that I find truly beautiful. The Sufis also do that. In all world religions, there are ways to do it in a celebratory and beautiful manner, with art making it an artistic expression. But you can also say that all of this distracts from the true faith, which is what the radical Muslims, the extremists, and the fundamentalists do, saying it must only be pure prayer. Nothing here should be worldly and beautiful. You don't need beautiful architecture for a mosque, and you don't need music. But unfortunately, it's those who feel this way that are prevailing.
What do you think is the main reason that this conservative or even radical interpretation has, so to speak, established itself and gained such prominence throughout the entire course of the 20th century?
Yes, luckily it hasn't taken hold everywhere yet, but it's certainly gaining ground step by step. And nowhere is this more clearly and tragically demonstrated than in Afghanistan. In Iran, of course, we've seen it assert itself very strongly over the past 5 decades, almost 5 decades. You can see that there was resistance there in Iran, yes. But on the other hand, you also see what happens when people rebel against it, what it leads to. This resistance was brutally crushed time and again. There have been several waves of protest in Iran against the Mullah regime, all violently suppressed. Most recently, in January of this year, we saw it. Within 2 days and just a few hours, tens of thousands were targeted, killed, and murdered. Incidentally, that's an action that I'd say massively strengthens the Taliban in neighboring Afghanistan, because people actually realize what can happen if you defy them, and the fear of resisting is now even stronger. That's because people, and one must specifically mention men, realize that by behaving in this way, they can gain and retain power, you see. And the Taliban exploit that. I mean, if you talk with the Taliban or if you observe them as a reporter, I was in Afghanistan, I did accompany them, I did meet them. Many of them are extremely devout. Indeed, they truly believe what they preach, holding on to this profoundly radical and extremist faith. But there are also many who don't really live that way themselves, you know. They still celebrate and absolutely sometimes even drink alcohol. But they wield it as a powerful instrument to cling to authority and to suppress everyone else around them.
You also describe at one point, so to speak, how this functions within the diaspora, if you will. I found that to be a really interesting part when you wrote about one of your aunts who was extremely religious or must have been very culturally minded, who convinced your parents to have you circumcised, even though your parents were actually against it and were themselves Christian at the time. That reminded me of a novel by Nadim Aslam, The Wasted Vigil, which describes something very similar for Pakistani communities in England. So this internal surveillance, this internal pressure that's built up, is that also considered to be so central? And that really poses the question, so to speak, why does that work? I mean, I'm assuming this aunt can't exactly exert physical violence or anything like that, but, so to speak, why do liberal voices often struggle so much or frequently remain silent in these communities?
Yes. Well, that was before my parents actually converted. I was still Muslim then, but a short time later they converted to Christianity, to Protestantism. And the interesting thing was my aunt came to visit from Pakistan, a Shiite Muslim, and very conservative, very devout, a doctor by profession, an anesthesiologist, and she realized that I wasn't circumcised. And there was constant pressure from family living dispersed across the world in Pakistan, England, and the US. It's just my parents who are in Pennsylvania, in Germany. And she came to visit, and there was always this constant pressure that my parents weren't raising us in a sufficiently Islamic manner. We can't read the Quran, I can't read Arabic, I can't pray properly, or rather I can't pray in the Islamic way at all. We didn't do that either, and so forth. There were always points of criticism, and this aunt was visiting for 3 weeks, and she saw and realized that I wasn't circumcised. I was 8 years old. Boys are usually circumcised as infants. She then pressured them, because she insisted this is how it should be, and he simply must be circumcised. She added that it can be done at 8, and my parents, I believe, yielded primarily because she was my father's eldest sister and a figure of authority and deep respect, and essentially someone my father truly loved. It was his elder sister, you see. And then, to make matters worse, our family doctor completely betrayed my trust, saying, well, circumcision is a practice found in all cultures, or at least in many of them. And also, from a medical standpoint, it's actually not bad at all to do it. It's quite all right. So, and then my aunt found a doctor. Coincidentally, in the nearby district town, there was a doctor with Egyptian roots. She immediately assumed he was Muslim, would know exactly how to perform the procedure correctly, and she insisted on it. Then I was circumcised. She was there since she's an anesthesiologist. She really wanted to witness it and be present, and for me, that was just truly dreadful. And what was very strange was that she then left, and a few months later, my parents converted, and then I was baptized. So that's quite strange. I was circumcised, then baptized, but that's how it goes. It really comes down to this kind of social pressure, and I believe that it's likely very strong in numerous religious communities, particularly if they are deeply devout. But among Muslims, I've observed, and I'm quite familiar with it, that it's fundamentally very strong indeed. So why don't you pray? Do you know the Quran? Much care is taken to ensure that it's done this way. For instance, if you don't raise your children according to Islamic principles, or if your daughter dresses too freely and not appropriately, it's quite possible you'll receive some serious criticism from the community. So it's a kind of mutual monitoring. Not everyone sees that as a bad thing. Some also think it gives you a framework that you know how you're supposed to live. You know, it gives me rules, it gives me stability. Personally, I find it an incredible restriction of freedom. This would greatly bother me. The main reason my parents usually managed to escape this pressure, except when my aunt visited from Pakistan for her holidays, was that they resided in a small village. Our family, consisting of my parents, my sister, and myself, lived in this village where there were no other Muslims at all. So they could really do as they wanted. I believe if my parents had moved to a large city with many more Muslims and Pakistanis, the pressure would have been significantly different, and I truly think I would have grown into a very different person.
But does that mean that the liberals are in the minority, or is the pressure just that great? Why is it that if the conservatives were actually in the minority, how can a minority maintain such immense pressure that people don't simply respond with, we're being pressured, we'll resist it, we don't care,
Yeah, so I genuinely can't even tell if this minority, the one that thinks so conservatively, is actually a minority at all. I believe that overall, a significant number of Muslims are indeed conservative. I can't say how many of them now think in Islamist terms, meaning they genuinely desire Islam to permeate every facet of life, extending beyond what a religion typically entails, delving into political spheres, the Islamist ideology, and so forth. Just last week in Germany, there was a study by the Federal Criminal Police Office that found, based on questioning various key points, for example, agreement or disagreement with the statement, the Islamic theocracy is the best of all forms of government, but also statements like, Jews should have less influence in our society. Their agreement and disagreement were inquired about. And what shockingly emerged was this. 11.5% fully agreed, indicating they are to be classified as Islamist. And 33.6%, I believe, are latently Islamist, thus showing a clear tendency towards that direction. This implies that we are talking about over 45%, meaning nearly half of the Muslim population in Germany leans in this particular direction, or can be categorized as such. And that is, of course, concerning also for what it means for our society. And others, well, they're silent, too quiet. I get it when liberal Muslims say, we won't take a stance on this because what do we have to do with them? Those are people we want nothing to do with. We distance ourselves from them. I grasp that emotionally, but I also perceive that if all of you choose to remain silent, this issue will simply continue to escalate and expand much further. And I truly believe that change can only ever come from within. I mean, from the outside, one can demand things, criticize. I also see myself doing that from outside, as I'm no longer Muslim. Yes, I actually converted with my parents, and since I was 19, I've been non-denominational. I engage with Islam for familial reasons, but also because I lived as a foreign correspondent in various Islamic countries. And it truly perturbs me when I witness the events unfolding in Islamic societies, the escalating radicalization across various nations like Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and even Bangladesh, a country often overlooked but which is undergoing significant Islamization, leading to the erosion of fundamental freedoms. But I also see here how it's slowly disappearing and how we give in to things that I think we, as a free society, shouldn't. Things like, for example, is it permissible to make jokes about religion? That is something about which I say that as a free society we have fought for centuries to be allowed to do exactly that. And the Enlightenment is an achievement, or the results of the Enlightenment are an achievement. And now we're giving that up so carelessly. I once did an experiment because I saw a report in a rather right-wing populist media outlet. They wrote that if you ask CHAPT to make a joke about Muhammad, it simply refuses to do so. And I actually tried it then. I don't know if it still works that way today, but probably. It's constantly changing. But just a few weeks and months ago when I was writing this book, I actually asked ChatGPT, the AI, make a joke about Jesus. I received a joke. It wasn't particularly funny though, but ChatGPT actually made a joke about Jesus. Make a joke about Buddha, about Abraham, about Moses, about all sorts of religious figures, and you always got a joke as an answer. More or less funny, then I asked, make a joke about Muhammad. Then the answer came, I don't make jokes about religious figures as that offends religious sensibilities. And I find that to be quite telling because artificial intelligence does, after all, rely on the data it uncovers. And it's overtly apparent that Islam is handled with a distinct approach compared to other religions. This is because feelings are perceived as especially wounded within that context, and Muslims tend to respond with a particularly radical fervor. And I find that to be truly difficult, and that's precisely why I'm writing against it.
That was going to be my question. Is this, from what we like to call the majority society in this country, a case of misguided tolerance? Is that fear itself? Criticism also arises that in interreligious dialogue, it's the more conservative Islamic associations that gain strength rather than the liberal forces. So what exactly could be the reason for that?
It's a mixture of several things. On the one hand, we see there is criticism that comes primarily from the far right. However, it's an incredibly broad generalization, you see. They often claim Islam is a terrorist ideology, that all Muslims are terrorists or completely backward individuals. In Germany, I hear this expression, millionfold remigration. By that, they mainly mean Muslims and even people like me, although I'm not even a Muslim. But by that, they mean everyone who is perceived as Muslim in some way, shape, or form, and that is wrong. I consider that to be a fatal flaw. I mean, what do we want to do? Really? Millionfold remigration? Do we want to kill everyone, forcibly convert them? That won't work. We must find a way to live together peacefully. However, that means that we have to contain and rein in the radicals and extremists, and also actively oppose them and their ideologies. From the center, from the political center, I hear far too little, partly from ignorance, I believe, because people are simply unwilling to acknowledge that this is indeed the situation. You notice this more and more strongly now because especially in the past 10 or 11 years, since 2015, many Muslims have joined our societies, and you start to truly perceive the influence that this has, even on a small scale, which is sometimes completely unproblematic, but sometimes it is problematic. So it's a matter of ignorance, but there's also this apprehension, this fear of being unfairly labeled as right-wing. One doesn't want to sound like the AfD or the FPO here. You certainly don't want to be labeled as far-right extremist or perceived as xenophobic or Islamophobic. No, you definitely don't want that at all. Then there are buzzwords like Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism. Both are terms that I personally choose not to utilize, as I perceive them to be politically charged buzzwords, primarily designed to stifle criticism and silence those who voice it, effectively suppressing any dissent. But this criticism is absolutely necessary. And then there's something that really astonishes me, particularly in the recent months and years, since 2023, honestly, especially since the 7th. October 2023, there's been a rather bizarre and frankly terrifying endorsement from certain segments of the far left for these Islamist currents. For example, they perceive Hamas not merely as a brutal, dangerous, or even a violent group, but somehow also as a comprehensible resistance movement. But somehow also a truly understandable resistance movement. And regarding October the 7th, October 2023, I've heard quite often people stating, yes, that's terrible, however. And that but bothers me immensely. There is no but there. Terror is terror, and it has to be called what it is. And of course, then you get a comment like, you have to see the whole story. Of course, everything has a backstory, but here we are talking about terror. This is about a singular, horrific attack where more Jews were brutally murdered all at once than at any point since the Holocaust itself. You must name it that way. And when discussing it, I believe we shouldn't always use the but or refer to them as victims and poor souls from the global south and so on. That really frightens me. And I witnessed it recently in Vienna, right here in our city, where a demonstration, a mournful vigil, was held to commemorate the slain Ayatollah Khamenei, organized by Iranians, specifically by Mullah supporters. And there were even Austrian students present wearing keffirs. And then the organizer of this address stepped forward and announced, "Men, go this way, women, go that way." The students then complied with these instructions. And I really wondered, how? How can you participate in something like that? These are probably all students who consider themselves politically left-leaning, who learn in their gender studies seminars that gender segregation is wrong, yet they readily go along with all of it here. It's accepted without a word of protest. Homophobia is accepted. Patriarchy is accepted. In other words, gender segregation. That really bothers me, and it ultimately empowers the extremists.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because my next question was going to be about that, whether it might be related to a certain, since it's now coming from the left or progressive side, which is inherently tied to a culturalistic understanding of Islam. You describe in your book that it's mainly about Islamists. When you once took a stance in favor of the Mettbrötchen, a raw minced pork and onion roll, you faced severe backlash, accused of being Islamophobic. It was as if your intention was to vigorously promote pork, directly opposing Islamic principles. Now there was, I believe it was even around this very demonstration you described. I believe you recently wrote somewhere on social media that if the regime in Iran falls, you'll open a bottle of sparkling wine. To which the left then inquired whether you drink alcohol, essentially prescribing to you or culturally pigeonholing you into what you're permitted to do, or as a Muslim, which you are no longer, but stemming from such a family or background, whether it's also connected to the fact that there are indeed very collectivistic understandings prevalent. Understandings that prevail, and it's not so much about the individuals and their own personal relationship with religion.
Yes, absolutely. It's a very ideological way of thinking. Indeed, it's this particular mindset that also stems from post-colonialism theory, where the concept of a global north exists. These are the perpetrators, yes, capitalist, wealthy, and then the global south, all victims, poor and exploited. And you certainly cannot deny that there is, of course, some truth to the idea that there are rich countries and poor countries, and all of that is true. But to pigeonhole everything into just these two terms, and then to act as if they are all a single entity, as if they all share some kind of common destiny, and then to also pick and choose what doesn't fit. Israel, of course, although geographically located elsewhere, is placed in the global north. But the Iranian protest movement against the Mullah regime is also the global north because they are supposedly pro-Shah. As a child of Pakistani immigrants, I myself should actually be categorized as belonging to the global south. No, but of course I'm also the global north because I grew up in Germany, and from that perspective I just talk too much like the global north. So that's really all it's fundamentally an ideology that comes disguised as science from that particular place. And that's how it is with these protests. It's just ideological, and that's why you can't get anywhere.
Well, you'll likely be accused of having become westernized or having adapted to this culture. And in principle, that's exactly the same criticism that comes from the left or from these left-wing progressive groups, which is formulated in the exact same way by the Islamists, who probably accuse you of the very same thing, right? That you've betrayed them for the favor of the West.
The Islamists accuse me of being a traitor because ultimately I have converted to their belief system. For the Sunni Islamists, I am inherently seen as very difficult to comprehend, if not someone who must be outright rejected, primarily due to my Shiite heritage. And there's this big Sunni-Shiite conflict, which is still a dominant factor. That was always difficult for me, for example, to speak as a journalist with the Taliban, or with representatives of the Islamic State, or with Al-Qaeda people, that's all Sunni, because they can tell from my first name alone that it's Shiite. It's a very Shiite first name. And for them, of course, I was always a kind of traitor. From the ISIS Sunni extremists' viewpoint, Shiites are seen as traitors, people who contaminate what they consider pure, true Islam, leading it astray in the wrong direction. It was always more difficult for me than it would have been for a white German reporter named Robert or Tim, because such a person was so clearly in the wrong faction. He's white anyway, and Christian or atheist or whatever, so that was not an issue. You could talk to him, but I was, so to speak, the culprit who actually has the right faith but is now leading it in the wrong direction as a Shiite. That's what comes from them. From the left, it's that I contradict their ideology. I'm someone who really wants to please Germans, even though I myself am German, but then you realize just how incredibly racist that actually is. Then suddenly they're playing with my name, making some stupid jokes. The kind of thing I used to only get from the right-wing corner now also comes from the left side. Well, I'm accused of being a token, like a Kinder Surprise German brown on the outside, but white on the inside. A Kinder Chocolate German heard that too, brown outside, white inside. A coconut, also brown outside, white inside. This type of criticism comes from the left. And from the right, in turn, they say I'm actually too friendly to Islam, that I'm not critical enough, so I should just condemn it outright. And the fact that I even mention any positive things, like how there are naturally good aspects such as culture, specific cultural elements, that's far too lenient for them and so on. And a nuanced perspective isn't wanted there either, and to them I'm just an Islamist in the end. Or someone who's only criticizing in a disguised way, but in reality I want Islam. That's also quite absurd because, as I've mentioned, I wasn't raised or socialized as a Muslim. However, that's what they believe and actively spread online. That's how it is. I'm comfortable in this role because if I get criticism from all extremes, I must be doing something right. But of course, it sometimes makes you worried, especially when you're out there as a public figure. You never truly know if it's going to remain solely verbal criticism.
But nothing like that has happened yet. I mean, there's also...
Yes.
Critics who say similar things to you who can't really live without police protection anymore.
Exactly, yes, it's true. Thankfully, it hasn't escalated that far for me. However, those who live under police protection, and it's important to be honest about this, do so primarily because of threats emanating from Islamist factions. So yes, that's where it is. It doesn't come from another side, and that's where the danger is the greatest. I myself actually had police protection for a while. But that was several years ago. At that time, I received threats from the far right side, but that was just for a period of time. Bad enough. But yes, for now I can manage without it, and I hope it stays that way.
Okay, you just mentioned that the Islamist side is probably the most dangerous in terms of immediate threats to life and limb. However, if we take a moment to reflect on them at the very end of our conversation, we can certainly conclude that there is immense resistance to your critique emanating from the far right, or, to put it another way, the right-wing factions. There's criticism from the conservative Islamic or Islamist side, and also from large parts, or at least some parts, of the culturalist or authoritarian post-colonial left. Very strong criticism. So, what would you say one can actually do in order to bolster? So what would you say can be done to bolster rational discourse or rational criticism, to make positions such as those you represent more robust, and to afford them greater influence?
I would wish for the societal mainstream, which is already quite broad, encompassing views from conservative to progressive. There's a significant portion that can still be considered the middle ground to become much louder and more forceful. Because the more individuals who assert, this is our perspective and this is how we offer our critique, the more challenging it naturally becomes for extremists to identify specific targets and launch attacks on people. On the other hand, such individuals will always exist. I fundamentally advocate for open dialogue and genuine exchange. I make an effort to engage in conversation with just about everyone. I attend events that are very, very left-wing, very right-wing, and even very Islamic, and I speak with the people there. But of course, there's always a boundary. Eventually, you realize when individuals are so extremist that they no longer listen, clutching solely to their own ideology. Then, a conversation really isn't worthwhile. You don't really need to talk to Islamists, nor to right-wing extremists. But you should always try to see if you can bring people back, and that's what's important. And second, it's absolutely crucial to criticize discriminately, to do it and not stay silent. When one remains silent, it only escalates further. Every form of extremism thrives and expands when it encounters no verbal opposition whatsoever. And naturally, we must also reinforce our society and its structures in such a way that certain actions are simply not permitted, nor can they even be considered possible. When schools tell me, we simply don't know how to deal with boys in class saying, I won't take orders from a female teacher, from a woman. When female teachers tell me they don't know how to handle being insulted, or girls not being allowed to participate in swimming lessons and other similar situations, when you simply lack the knowledge to address any of that. Or there was a recent incident just the other day where a teacher mentioned that the father of one of her female students had told her his daughter was forbidden from sitting next to a boy in class because it was deemed un-Islamic and simply not permissible. And if we don't actively counter that, then we truly face a very serious problem. I believe we all need to deeply consider this together and then effectively strengthen these essential state institutions.
Exactly, that actually was going to be my very last question. You've placed a strong emphasis on the civil society arena, so to speak, specifically on openly voicing criticism and defending oneself against such issues. Do you have any, well, maybe suggestions is too strong a word, but wishes for how politics should handle this? Do you feel that this issue has been given too little consideration lately? That this problem hasn't received enough attention? Is understanding broadening, or are you saying then, what is it?
Well, my impression is that, first of all, it's also characterized by a lack of knowledge within politics. I'm referring to politics, and I can mainly speak for Germany, as that's my primary focus, where I extensively work, observe, and write, where discussions have taken place with individuals on the Islamic side, treating them as partners when they absolutely should not have been regarded as such. DITIB, the religious authority of the Turkish government, for example, where you think they really aren't the ones who should be the voice of Islam. It's about seeing the diversity there. I think it should be done with a fundamentally benevolent approach because ultimately it's about creating a peaceful coexistence. And that is why we must strengthen the liberals, the reasonable, the open-minded, and the democratic forces. And yet, on the other hand, it's also essential to set very precise rules. I certainly don't think it's right to engage in appeasement and then make too many concessions. And that's something we can discuss. For example, I think what Austria is doing with the headscarf ban for girls up to 14 in schools is right. I genuinely believe it's appropriate, as I consider a young girl wearing a headscarf from an early age firstly doesn't do it voluntarily, but because her parents say so, and she might not even mind, but still it's not voluntary. And this girl, when she reaches 15, 16 or 17, will find it significantly more challenging to remove that headscarf than a girl who didn't wear one until she was 14, at least not at school, and then at the age of 15 decides she might just put it on anyway. There is a lack of voluntariness, according to my impression, and this is also substantiated by statements from psychologists, which makes things simpler this way. So, I think that's a good step in principle. Whether this law, which is supposed to apply from this next school year, will hold up before the Constitutional Court, we'll see. But I think it's the right thing to do. And on the other hand, there are things where I find the criticism ridiculous. I don't think we really had that in Austria, but in Germany there was this criticism of the so-called Ramadan lighting. The fact that cities decorated their streets and pedestrian zones with lights for Ramadan, the fasting month, caused a terrible uproar from the right wing, the Islamization of the Occident. And at the same time, there was a terrible uproar from the very conservative Islamic side, that it was an adoption of Western un-Islamic tradition. Christmas. There's no Ramadan lighting, there's Christmas lighting, now you're copying that too, and with that, you're not doing anything Islamic or anything of that sort. But then I saw children, Muslim children, who were absolutely delighted, thinking, finally, our religion, our festival, is being recognized here too. And then I thought to myself, if right-wing extremists and Islamic extremists get so worked up, then it must be the right thing. And that's why I thought it was totally great.
Well then, as we conclude, all that remains for me is to extend my gratitude for this insightful interview and to earnestly urge our readers to delve into Hasnain Kazim's book, which truly presents some exceptionally compelling ideas.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Mena-Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank. Besuchen Sie auch unsere Website. Dort finden Sie täglich neue aktuelle Berichte und ausführliche wissenschaftlich fundierte Hintergrundanalysen zur Geschichte und Gegenwart der MENA-Region.